Remember, you don't have to watch this video if you'd rather read the reading assignments in the course. That's totally fine. What I'm doing is I'm basically summarizing the key points from all of the reading that I thought were the most valuable, important, that I want to make sure that you get. But if you'd rather read, please go do that instead. If you like hearing things read to you, like me personally, I'm a big fan of audiobooks. I wanted to make sure you had this as an option. And plus, as we're all different learners, we all react to different modes of getting the information into our brains, whether it's through our eyes, through our ears, whatever. Let's get started. Movement. The formal theory of composition in two-dimensional art, including painting and photography, holds that there should be an intentional visual entry point as well as an exit point in every composition. The entry point is where you look at first. The composition should then provide an internal motion that guides the eye to the exit point, which is where you leave the world of the composition. As it has been said, there are no rules for making good photographs, only good photographs. So I would suggest that you don't follow formally this notion of movement, entry, and exit, regardless of what works for your particular compositions. However, as with any classically tested theory, there is at least some basis for the concepts of entry and exit. It is certainly true that a photograph with neither an entry point nor an exit point is likely to be static and therefore probably boring. So remember to use those leading diagonal lines and keep an eye on what's the focal point of your image, what's the most focused part of your image, and in contrast, what's the brightest part of your image, because viewers will look at the brightest part of an image or the most focused part, or they'll have a battle between them, and you need to balance that to keep it interesting and so that the viewer knows what your focal point is. So please consider the concept of movement in your compositions and keep in mind the issues of where the viewer will begin and where the viewing ends. In some situations, it's okay to decide you don't need a formal entry and exit point. This should usually be a conscious decision on the part of you, the image creator, and ignoring the idea of movement in your photograph does risk creating imagery that is visually stagnant and not as dynamic as it could be. Shape and form. How do you know when the shapes and forms in your black and white compositions will be effective? The best way to pre-visualize the impact of shapes on your photos is to practice separating form and function. In other words, try to forget about the subject matter of your photo as you abstract a composition from the shapes that are in front of you. In an ideal world, form should follow function, and the two should be inextricably partnered in a dance that will last as long as we have material things to photograph. This feeling in a composition where form and function are just perfectly married is definitely something we should all aspire to. But as a practical matter, if you keep what something is too much in mind, then that very isness then that very isness, the function of the object, will intrude into your vision and overlay issues of pure form and design. So basically, if I were to sum this up, color photograph of an object is just a picture of that there object. It's a representation of the reality that we know. But you take a black and white photograph of that object, now it's a metaphor to illustrate whatever idea or concept that we have in our mind. And that's the dynamic power of black and white photography. And I think it's why all of us are really drawn to create it. Low key. While a high key photo is predominantly presented in white and light tones, low key images are mostly very dark or black. When this kind of image works, it's because the darkness that encompasses most of the photo focuses attention on the areas that are not dark, providing a sense of mystery. Low-key imagery tends to work because it's human nature to replace the mystery of darkness with the imaginary scenes or objects. To make this kind of image, you should look for an overall dark scene. In addition to a pervading sense of darkness, the scene needs to be lit with intermittent light. In an effective low-key image, one area of interest can be specifically lit. Alternatively, there can be lighting more spread out across a generally dark scene. In this case, it's often effective to look for chiaroscuro, which is a contrasty, moody lighting that shows contrast between shadows and brightness. Caravaggio, an Italian painter, was most famous for pioneering this technique. Check out some of these images. So, low-key and chiaroscuro. Post-processing techniques can help you create a low-key image after the fact. However, it is very desirable to start with a photographic subject that is appropriate for a low-key treatment. High-key. I've already noted that black and white photography from a formal perspective is largely about the contrast between lights and darks. Powerful black and white compositions often require very dark blacks and very light whites, both in the same image. It's interesting that the opposite approach can also work well. High-key photos are predominantly white, bright, and can be characterized as overexposed, and often incorrect characterization when the high-key exposure is intentional. Just remember, don't clip your white points, because typically you don't need need to do that to create high key photos. Low key photos are largely black or dark, and they can easily and often incorrectly be considered underexposed. In these images, the single key predominates. Particularly with high key imagery, there's very seldom much contrast at all. Now, with low key photos, it's okay if you clip your black point because then the blacks are really becoming more of a graphic element to support the overall composition. To create a high key image, look for a subject that is well lit and quite bright in tonal values. You may think this goes without saying, but if you look around, you may be surprised at how few compositions actually meet this requirement. A high key composition as a whole may work best if it operates by intrigue, mystery, and indirection. In some ways, it may not matter that much what your actual subject is, since high key compositions can be built around many different kinds of subject matter. You should look for simple, evocative, subtle lines and shapes that evoke a sense of wonder in the viewer. High key effects can be created in post-processing, although these after-the-fact techniques will not be appropriate for all photos. It's always best to shoot with high key in mind. This means intentionally overexposing compared to the camera's idea of what the correct exposure should be. But again, try not to clip your highlights. It's okay to bracket by shooting many frames at different exposures. That way you can pick the exposure that works best. I like to do it that way, especially if it's an important scene. I bet you'll be surprised by how far to the overexposure side a high key image needs to be. So don't be timid about your overexposures, especially when you're going for a high key effect. With a properly lit high key image that is already creatively overexposed, exotic, and attractive, you can proceed to use the post-processing techniques explained later to amplify the impact of this effect. Shades of gray. By definition, every black and white image consists of a range of grays. I've noted that the majority of black and white photos work by contrasting dark against light. These darks and lights are shades of gray, of course. High key images consisting of a subtler shade of gray work with tones toward the lighter end of the scale. Low key images primarily use the dark tones on the gray scale. Yet another effective black and white strategy is to employ midtones as the predominant compositional element. These compositions use midtone gray values to work together in an endless compositional dance. The nearness of tonal values means that there are relatively few sharp breaks in a predominantly midtone gray composition. You won't find many hard black forms or white areas that are highlights. When a mid-tone gray composition works, it is because the eye looks to the subtlety of the relationship between the tonal gradations. So when you're considering this kind of composition, be careful to present tonal values that work well together. In credits. For this video, I want you to be connected to the author Harold Davis. I have used some of my own thoughts and words in this video, but some words, the good ones, as I always say, come directly from the book, Creative Black and White Digital Photography Tips and Techniques, the second edition. Specifically, I use parts from sections titled Movement, Shape and Form, High Key and Low Key, and Shades of Gray. So, as always, I hope this helped. Can't wait to see what you make.